Hello and welcome to another HanDrinksSolo wine info video, and today we're discussing Jolandie Fouché's Wolf and Woman Grenache Noir Rosé 2022. As far as I'm concerned, this is one of South Africa's more compelling rosés and regularly pops up on my list of South Africa's serious rosés, all of which are worth hunting down. Jolandie Fouché is an incredibly exciting young winemaker who really seems to be getting better and better vintage after vintage. She began her career working on the legendary estate of Uitkyk in Stellenbosch before moving on to work on Saronsberg in Tulbagh and eventually ending up as head winemaker at Kloovenberg in the Swartland before finally turning her focus to Wolf and Woman Wines, her very own project. She also spent harvests in both Australia and California at various points in her career, giving her a decidedly new world perspective on her winemaking. That said, when it comes to making her own wines, she leans quite heavily into a love for old wines and simple winemaking techniques. She chooses to work exclusively with native yeasts or spontaneous fermentation. She avoids enzymes wherever possible in her winemaking and also works almost exclusively with dry land farmed cultivars, which includes her Grenache Noir Rosé 2022, the wine of the day. When it comes to exploring the wine in the glass, there's a really interesting element of strawberry cheesecake on the nose. This sits alongside fresher elements of homemade lemonade and perhaps pomegranate. Now, while most of this wine is barrel fermented, it is all old oak and larger 500-litre barrels, and so there's no real obvious hint of oak on the nose. What we do know is that the wine goes fully through malolactic conversion, which means some of the malic acid in the wine is converted to lactic acid, and this explains that rather lovely strawberry cheesecake element that we got on the aromas. And when we take a sip, there is certainly no shortage of brightness and freshness, despite going through 100% malolactic conversion. Now, if one is to compare this wine with previous vintages, I'd say that there's noticeably less texture on the palate, but perhaps an increased sense of clarity. There are these super clean and clear notes of red cherry and pomegranate and ruby grapefruit and blood orange, all laid out neatly in a row. Now, outside of vintage variation, which will always be there, it's also worth noting that in 2022, Jolandie Fouché produced 4,400 bottles of this rosé, which is a massive jump up from the 2,300 bottles that she produced in the last vintage. In the last vintage, 100% of the wine was barrel fermented, whereas in this current vintage, 40% of the wine was fermented in stainless steel tank. Now, as Jolandie explains it, this tank component allows the lees to settle more quickly, contributing to less texture perhaps, but adding more clarity as we tasted in the glass. As a side note, just to add a little controversy, there have been some studies that seem to indicate that actually a cylindrical stainless steel tank with a conical bottom allows for the most effective torus vortex during fermentation. It is this torus vortex that keeps lees in suspension and contributes the increased texture. The implication of this is that in fact, stainless steel tank fermentation should add more texture than perhaps barrel fermentation or even concrete egg fermentation. But if we're to let our experience of what is in the glass guide us, then it would seem that Jolandie's take on the matter reflects reality a little more than the lab studies on torus vortexes. Now, outside of this delightful little Swartland rosé, you may also have noticed that Jolandie Fouché's Wolf and Woman Syrah 2021 earned itself a 5-star rating from the Platters Guide for the 2023 edition. But for those of you who may want to dig a little deeper, it is thoroughly worth doing so, as she has an incredible old vine Pinotage, an old vine Chenin Blanc, as well as a really sharp little Grenache Blanc, which is the most recent addition to her range of wines. Okay, so that's all we have time for today, but if you enjoyed the video, then consider subscribing to the HanDrinksSolo YouTube channel, where we publish 6 videos each month discussing things like unusual cultivars, wine history, wine science, and some of the rising stars coming out of the dynamic South African wine list.